The sheriff's SUVs came rolling down the gravel road at exactly the wrong moment, or depending on who you ask, exactly the right one. Linda Harper was standing at the edge of the newly built dock with a pair of silver ceremonial scissors in her hand, the kind that cost more than most people's grocery bills for a month, and she was about 4 seconds away from cutting through a wide red ribbon strung between two freshly painted posts. Behind her stretched what the HOA newsletter had been calling the crown jewel of Cedar Ridge Estates. A $2 million marina built from scratch over the past 8 months, complete with floating walkways, a covered pavilion, a fuel dock, and 16 slip reservations already paid in full by residents who thought they were getting something extraordinary. Country music played from a rented sound system near the pavilion. Champagne flutes clinked. Someone had brought a photographer and a local TV news crew. The whole scene smelled like cedar decking, sunscreen, and new money, and it looked exactly the way Linda Harper had designed it to look like a community that had finally gotten what it deserved. Then the deputies stepped out of their vehicles, unspooling yellow tape from a spool, and the music stopped like someone had cut the cord with a knife. Linda Harper's smile didn't disappear all at once. It faded slowly the way a light bulb dims before it goes completely dark, and she turned toward the gravel road with her scissors still in her hand, blinking at the uniforms like she was waiting for someone to tell her this was a scheduling error, a miscommunication, the kind of thing that would be cleared up in 5 minutes with a phone call to the right person. Over 200 residents shifted on their feet, champagne in hand, following her gaze, and almost every single one of them turned in the same slow, collective motion toward the old man standing near the original bait shack at the edge of the property. He was holding a dented thermos of coffee, wearing a flannel shirt that had been washed so many times the plaid had gone soft, and he was watching the whole scene with the particular stillness of someone who has been expecting company for a very long time. The deputy raised his voice across the dock. "Mr. Dawson," a pause that lasted exactly the right amount of time. "Would you like us to seal the entire marina right now?" Ethan Dawson took a slow sip from his thermos. "That'd be fine," he said. To understand how $2 million in construction ended up getting sealed behind yellow tape on its own opening day, you have to go back much further than the HOA. You have to go back to 1948 when a man named Harold Dawson drove out to the eastern edge of Callaway County with a cashier's check in his breast pocket and bought 47 acres of land that included a spring-fed lake, 2 creeks, and a hillside of cedar and post oak that nobody else seemed to want. Harold had just come back from the Pacific. He was 31 years old, quietly exhausted in the way that men of that generation rarely talked about, and he wanted something that was entirely irrevocably his, something that couldn't be ordered taken from him, couldn't be reassigned, couldn't be folded into a strategy or repurposed for someone else's objective. He paid cash. The deed that the county clerk typed out that year included specific language, unusually specific for that era, that conveyed not just the surrounding acreage, but the lake bed itself, the shoreline, easement running the full perimeter, and the water control rights attached to the natural outlet creek. Harold didn't have a lawyer. He just had the instinct of a man who had survived enough to understand that the details matter, and that the difference between owning something and nearly owning it can be a single clause buried in a document nobody bothers to read. He planted a garden that first summer. He dug a well. He built a small wooden dock with his own hands and nailed a hand-painted sign to the post that read Dawson Lake, because in his mind, that was simply what it was. He had no grand plans for the property beyond that. He didn't want to develop it or subdivide it or leverage it into something bigger. He wanted to walk down to the water in the evenings and hear nothing but the frogs and the wind in the cedar, and for the first time since the war, that was enough to make a man feel entirely whole. Harold's son Robert grew up on that property through the 1950s and 60s, and he added to it the way the Dawson men tended to add to things quietly and with purpose, and without needing anyone to notice. Robert built a proper bait shack near the eastern shore, extended the dock with treated lumber, and installed a hand-pump gas lantern on the end post so he could fish after sundown without falling in. It was Robert who first drove young Ethan down to the water's edge before the boy could reliably spell his own name, sat him down on an overturned bucket, put a cane pole in his small hands, and told him to be patient. Ethan caught his first bass that morning. He remembered the weight of it, the surprise of it, the way his father's face broke into a grin that he rarely wore anywhere else. That grin only ever appeared at the lake. Ethan spent every summer of his childhood on that shore, and when he went off to study civil and hydraulic engineering at Texas A&M, he came back every break, every holiday, every long weekend he could justify. He married Emma Caldwell in the spring of 1989, and they had their wedding reception on the dock. 32 guests, a fiddle player, potato salad in a galvanized tub, and sunset going orange over the water. Emma loved the lake almost as much as Ethan did. She would wake before him some mornings and sit on the dock with her coffee watching the base ring the surface in the early light, and she told him once that the lake was the most honest place she had ever been because it didn't pretend to be anything other than itself. It didn't make promises. It didn't perform. It just was. Emma died of pancreatic cancer in 2014, and Ethan scattered her ashes from the end of the dock on a foggy November morning when the water was perfectly still. He didn't have any words prepared. He just stood there for a long time watching the fog drift. And the lake was the same that morning as every other morning, indifferent to grief in the way that only genuinely old things can be indifferent without being cruel. Then everything began to change, because Cedar Ridge Estates arrived, and with it, the particular kind of trouble that comes with a good suit and a laser pointer. The development started on the northern edge of Callaway County, about 3 miles from Ethan's property line, and then it crept south, the way these things do slowly at first, then with the sudden momentum of a completed road. Cedar Ridge Estates was a planned residential community aimed at what the marketing materials called active lifestyle families seeking natural surroundings, which is the kind of language that means the natural surroundings will be considerably altered to accommodate the lifestyles. The lots were graded and cleared in a wide arc around the eastern side of the county, and the roads went in, and then the model homes went in, and then the sales office opened in a trailer with a rendering of what the finished community would look like pinned to the wall behind the desk, a rendering that showed a sparkling lake in the background, which was Dawson Lake, which had not been asked permission and was not available for use in marketing materials, though nobody had mentioned that to the developer. The houses went up fast. Within 2 years, there were 340 homes, a community center, 2 swimming pools, and a set of HOA covenants thick enough to use as a doorstop. Ethan watched it from a distance. His property wasn't inside the HOA. He was adjacent to it, separated by a stretch of cedar fence line and the original deed markers that his grandfather had set in concrete in 1948. He had no particular objection to the new neighbors, not at first. People had to live somewhere, and Cedar Ridge Estates was not in itself a problem. He just wanted to be left alone with his thermos and his dock and his bait shack, and the herons that came to the shallow water every morning like they were keeping a standing appointment that predated the whole development by several decades. Linda Harper moved into Cedar Ridge Estates in late October of 2021, into a 4-bedroom house on the cul-de-sac closest to the lake, and within 4 months she had been elected HOA president by a margin that the newsletter described as a landslide of enthusiasm. She drove a white Range Rover with a personalized license plate and wore the kind of blazers that suggest a person is perpetually on their way to a meeting of significant importance. She had worked in corporate real estate development for 15 years before relocating to what she called a more intentional lifestyle, which apparently meant running the HOA with the intensity of a regional vice president without the regional vice president's accountability. She spoke in the particular cadence of someone who has attended a great many strategic planning sessions. Phrases like leverage our natural assets and create stakeholder value came out of her mouth with the smooth ease of long habit. The way phrases do when they have been said so many times they no longer require thought. Within 6 months of taking the HOA presidency, she had commissioned a feasibility study on what she called lake access enhancement, which was the first sign that Ethan Dawson's life was about to become significantly more complicated. She circulated the results at a HOA meeting in the spring, pointing at waterfront renderings with a laser pointer, and the room responded with exactly the kind of enthusiasm that well-designed renderings tend to generate, the enthusiasm of people imagining themselves inside an image, rather than thinking carefully about what would have to be true for that image to become real. The afternoon Linda Harper walked onto Ethan's dock without knocking, without calling. Without so much as a wave from the shore, Ethan was sitting in his aluminum lawn chair, repairing a section of mesh on his casting net. He heard the Range Rover on the gravel, heard the door, heard the footsteps on the wood planking of the dock, and he did not look up immediately. He finished the stitch he was working on. There was no reason to rush the stitch, and then he set the net down and looked at the woman standing at the end of his dock with two contractors behind her, all three of them studying the water line with the focused interest of people who are imagining something that isn't there yet. Linda introduced herself with the corporate smile, the one that goes wide fast and stays exactly the same shape throughout the conversation, regardless of what is being said, and she told Ethan that the HOA was exploring some exciting opportunities to enhance the lake experience for the whole community. Ethan asked her politely what community she was referring to. She explained in the patient tone of someone addressing a person who may not have fully understood the question that Cedar Ridge Estates was the community, and that the lake was a shared, natural resource that deserved proper investment and thoughtful development. Ethan told her the lake was not a shared resource. Linda nodded in the way that people nod when they are not listening, with slow, measured agreement, and she gestured toward the dock, toward the bait shack, toward the original wooden posts his grandfather had set decades ago. "Eventually," she said, "this dock will need to go." And then she turned and walked back up the shore with her contractors, all three of them making notes on their clipboards. And Ethan sat very still in his aluminum chair for a long time after the Range Rover had pulled back onto the road. He wasn't angry, not exactly. He was simply making note of something, the particular way Linda Harper said the word eventually, as if time and entitlement were the same force moving in the same direction, and all you needed was confidence and a good contractor to align them. 3 weeks later, Linda's attorney sent Ethan a letter with an offer to purchase the shoreline strip adjacent to Parcel 714B for $32,000. $32,000 for the shore of a lake his grandfather had bought outright, a strip whose current market value by any reasonable comparable sat north of $400,000. Ethan read the letter twice. He folded it carefully and put it in the drawer of his grandfather's desk. Then he went to bed, and he slept just fine. The survey stakes appeared on a Tuesday morning, orange plastic flags on thin wire rods staked into the ground at intervals along the eastern shoreline, Ethan's shoreline, and running in a line that crossed the old cedar fence as if it weren't there. They were not subtle. They were planted in a straight, deliberate row that crossed his grandfather's property line by at least 40 feet, and whoever had placed them had done so with the confidence of a person who has been told the paperwork supports them and has not personally verified the paperwork. Ethan pulled one out of the ground, looked at it for a moment, and put it in his truck. He drove to Linda Harper's house, knocked on the door, and when she answered, he held up the stake and told her calmly and without decoration not to build anything on his land. Linda told him with the same patient corporate smile that the HOA's survey team had confirmed the property lines and the project would move forward in accordance with county regulations. Ethan told her that her survey team was wrong. He did not elaborate. He did not raise his voice. He simply stated the fact the way he had stated engineering facts for 35 years, as something that was true whether or not the person across from him believed it. Linda said she appreciated his concern and that the HOA would keep him informed of developments. Then she closed the door. Ethan stood on her front step for a moment in the morning light, nodded once to himself, drove home, and got out the 3-ring binder he had bought from the office supply store. He wrote the date at the top of a fresh page and started a new section. The excavators arrived on a Friday morning in March. Ethan heard them from his kitchen, the low diesel rumble that you feel in your chest before you actually hear it with your ears. And he walked down to the shore and stood at the fence line and watched 2 machines begin to tear apart the eastern bank of his lake. They took out the stands of river reed that had been growing there since before he was born. They broke the ground around the shallow nesting area where the painted turtles had been coming every spring for as long as Ethan had been watching. The diesel smell drifted across the water and mixed with the cedar and the morning air, and it was deeply wrong in the way that only a smell can be wrong. Something your body recognizes as a violation before your brain has time to name it. Workers in orange vests moved along the bank with equipment and stakes, and someone had posted new flags along a line that extended well past where Ethan's fence posts stood, as if the fence itself had simply been decided away by people with clipboards and confidence and no particular interest in who had been there first. Linda Harper drove up mid-morning in the Range Rover and stood near the construction manager with a hard hat on over her blazer, and she used words like progress, and community investment and long-term enhancement, while the machines behind her chewed up the bank of a lake that had been in one family's hands for 76 years. The word that kept arriving in Ethan's mind as he stood at the fence line with his camera was not anger, and it was not outrage. It was something quieter and more specific. It was the word enough, said entirely to himself with the flat precision of a man who measures things for a living and knows exactly where a line is. Ethan photographed everything. Into the binder went photographs, GPS, coordinates, dates, witness names, and copies of every piece of paper that had anything to do with the lake or the HOA, or Linda Harper. He shot the survey stakes in place before pulling them. He shot the excavation equipment at the shoreline. He shot the flag line against the backdrop of his grandfather's fence posts so the juxtaposition would be clear to anyone looking at the images later. He shot the workers. He shot the machinery. He shot the destroyed reed beds and the churned-up nesting area and the diesel puddles at the water's edge. He had a surveyor friend come out and run independent measurements, and he kept a copy of those results in the binder under a dedicated tab, alongside a written statement from his friend about what he had observed. He began keeping a daily log, a simple spiral notebook, 1 page per day, times and activities and names of anyone he could identify. And when the HOA's crew, on a Wednesday afternoon in April, removed the original concrete marker posts that Harold Dawson had set into the ground in 1948, the ones with the family's initials stamped into the cement, Ethan photographed that too. He photographed each post in place before the removal. He photographed the hole where each one had been. He photographed the worker loading them into a wheelbarrow. He photographed the wheelbarrow being carried away down the bank, and he noted in his log the time and date and the color of the truck the crew arrived in. He was calm while he did it. He had decided to be calm because calm is the appropriate disposition for a man who knows exactly what is going to happen next and is simply waiting for the right moment to let it unfold in the right place in front of the right people. By June, the Marina had grown beyond anything the original HOA meeting had described, which was itself a significant accomplishment in ambition. What had started as a plan for a modest community dock and boat ramp had expanded meeting by meeting, rendering by rendering, into something that bore no resemblance to modest, and had acquired a scale and a cost structure that several HOA members had raised quiet concerns about, concerns that had been smoothed over by Linda's presentations and set aside in the general enthusiasm of forward motion. There were now 16 boat slips. There was a fuel dock extending 30 feet out over the water. There was a floating cafe platform, an actual structure with a roof and railings and electrical hookups anchored to the eastern shore on concrete pilings. There was a boat rental concession and a planned yacht club with a waiting list for memberships that Linda had begun selling at $1,200 per household. Construction crews worked 6 days a week, and the sound of hammering and power tools drifted across the lake in the mornings and mixed with what used to be birdsong. The HOA had hired a PR firm that produced a glossy brochure describing Cedar Ridge Estates as the premier lakefront lifestyle community in the Texas Hill Country, featuring photorealistic renderings of the marina filled with gleaming boats and smiling families in resort wear. The brochure did not mention Ethan Dawson or Harold Dawson or the deed that had been filed at the county courthouse in the spring of 1948. It did not mention the painted turtles or the river reeds or the herons or the eastern cove where Robert Dawson's ashes had settled into the water a decade ago. Those things were not relevant to the story Linda Harper was telling, and so they had simply been left out. The town hall meeting in late June was standing room only. Linda had set up a projector and was presenting what she called the Phase 2 expansion vision, which included maps showing the marina's eventual footprint extending along the eastern shore. Ethan sat in the third row and watched the presentation with the particular attention of someone who has already read the original documents and is now watching other people discuss them without knowing they exist. He noticed on the expansion map a small rectangle marked Future Development Zone Eastern Cove. He had been to the Eastern Cove that morning. His father's ashes were scattered there, mixed into the water near the big flat limestone shelf where Robert Dawson used to sit in the evenings and watch the herons come in over the water. Linda clicked through her slides and talked about return on investment and amenity value and what the marina would do for property values across the county. Ethan did not raise his hand. He did not ask a question. He drove home after the meeting, sat at his grandfather's desk, opened the binder, and added a new tab labeled Phase 2. He looked at the Eastern Cove notation for a long time, thinking about what his father had said once about the difference between men who build things that last and men who build things that look good in a slide presentation. They were not just building a marina. They were paving over a family's entire history, one optimistic rendering at a time. He got up, walked down to the lake in the dark, and stood at the water's edge without a flashlight, listening to the frogs and making a decision about timing. The decision was not yet. He noticed the following week that county inspectors were accompanying Linda on her site visits, not the kind who come to stop things, but the kind who come to help things continue moving forward. Ethan watched from across the water through binoculars tracking. The county courthouse in Callaway County is a limestone building from 1912 that smells like old paper and central air conditioning, and the particular institutional quiet of a place where records are kept by people who take records seriously. There is something reassuring about a building like that, the weight of the stone, the deliberate slowness of the hallways, the sense that information kept there stays kept, and that what was filed in 1948 is still filed in the same order, in the same drawer, waiting for the next person who needs it. Ethan had been there before to pay property taxes to record a minor easement adjustment 2 decades ago. But the morning he walked in with his grandfather's original deed folded in his jacket pocket, he walked in with a purpose that felt different from anything routine. The clerk at the records desk was a woman named Martha Ruiz, who had worked in that office for 23 years and who had the calm efficiency of someone who has located important documents for anxious people many, many times. She did not make Ethan feel like a nuisance. She brought him what he asked for in the order he asked for it, and when he looked up from the documents with an expression that Martha had learned to recognize, the expression of a person who has found what they were hoping to find and found it bigger than they expected, she gave him a small, knowing nod and did not make a production of it. The first thing Ethan confirmed was what he had always understood but needed documented with certified ink zoning and ownership are not the same thing. The HOA had been operating, and apparently the county inspectors had been nodding along on the assumption that because the marina fell within the Cedar Ridge Estates zoning district, the HOA had the right to develop the shoreline. This is the kind of mistake that happens when people confuse administrative maps with property deeds, and it is a far more common mistake than most people realize. Zoning tells you what can be built, where according to county land use rules. A deed tells you who owns the ground it will be built on. They are related documents, but they are not interchangeable, and treating one as the other is the kind of error that ends real estate careers when the right person finally looks closely. The second thing Ethan found buried in the original 1948 filing was the precise language his grandfather's deed used to convey not just the surrounding acreage, but the lake bed itself to the center line of the outlet creek, including all mineral and water rights attached to the natural watershed. Harold Dawson had apparently insisted on this language. The county clerk at the time had noted in the margin in faded pencil, buyer requested specific water rights language verified and recorded. Rebinsan. Harold Dawson, veteran farmer man of few words, had also been a man who understood that what you own is exactly what the paper says you own, not 1 inch more or less. Ethan sat with that document for a while and thought about his grandfather in a way he hadn't in years, with something that wasn't quite pride and wasn't quite grief, but lived comfortably between the two. The third discovery involved the HOA's permit application itself, which Ethan had obtained 3 weeks earlier through a public records request. The application had used the county's current zoning map as the basis for its property boundary claim. Not a deed survey. A zoning map. This is like using a road map to prove you own the road. The permit office had apparently approved it without requesting the underlying deed survey, which meant the county had issued construction permits for land the applicant did not own. Martha Ruiz asked quietly if he needed certified copies of anything. He told her he needed certified copies of all of it. The fourth discovery arrived in a folder labeled Flood Control Agreements 1970 to Present. Inside was a document from 1973 signed by both Callaway County and the State Water Authority, establishing Dawson Lake as a flood control buffer zone and designating the eastern shoreline, the exact location of Linda Harper's fuel dock, as a protected easement requiring state-level environmental review for any structural modification. This review had never been requested. The HOA's environmental filing had been submitted to the county but not to the state water authority, and the shoreline boundary authorization used in the permit application did not appear to have been issued by anyone with the legal authority to issue it. Martha Ruiz did not say anything when Ethan set that document down and sat quietly for a full minute. She simply got up and offered to make him a photocopy. He told her he would need several. Ethan did not file anything the day after the courthouse visit. He did not file anything the week after. He drove home with his certified copies, added them to the binder, and made a cup of coffee, and sat on the dock for the rest of the afternoon watching construction crews on the eastern shore continue their work. He watched them with the neutral attention of a man who no longer needs to stop what is happening, because he understands that what is happening will eventually stop itself. He could have gone to the county the very next morning and had the permits suspended within days. He had every document required: the certified deed, the flood control agreement, the permit application discrepancy, the unauthorized boundary authorization. He had more than enough. But Ethan Dawson had spent 35 years as a hydraulic engineer working on flood systems and water control projects, and one of the things that profession teaches you genuinely teaches you, in the way that projects and failures and long experience teach you, is that the right time to release pressure from a system is not always the first moment you have the ability to do so. You learn to read the system. You learn when adding more will make the eventual correction more thorough, and when acting too early produces a partial result that leaves room for argument and delay and appeal. Sometimes you wait, sometimes you let the pressure build exactly as long as it needs to build, and then the release is complete and permanent rather than partial and arguable. Every board they nailed down, every foot of fuel pipe they installed, every membership fee Linda collected, and every investor she quietly brought into the project, all of it was becoming evidence. All of it was adding to a structure that would have to come down, and the taller it got, the more complete the accounting would be when the moment finally came. He called Aaron Brooks on a Thursday evening. Aaron was a Callaway County deputy sheriff who had grown up 2 properties over from the Dawson place, who had gone fishing in this lake as a boy with his own father, and who had the careful, methodical nature of someone who takes his job seriously without taking himself too seriously. They met at the diner on Farm Road 1212 the following Saturday morning, and Ethan laid the binder out on the table between the coffee cups and went through it systematically, tab by tab, the way an engineer presents findings without drama, without embellishment, letting the documents do the work. Aaron read slowly. He asked a few questions. He requested copies of the shoreline authorization discrepancy and the 1973 flood control agreement. When he had read everything twice, he sat back in his booth and looked out the window at the farm fields going past in the morning light. He said, in the measured tone of a man choosing his words with care, if they submitted documents to the county that they knew didn't reflect the actual ownership situation, Ethan, this isn't a civil property dispute anymore. Ethan said he understood that. Aaron asked what Ethan wanted to happen. Ethan said he wanted the truth to go on the record in a way that couldn't be undone in public in front of the right people. Aaron said he'd look into the proper procedures and be in touch. They finished their coffee. They paid the bill. 2 weeks later, the HOA mailed out grand opening invitations to Harper Cove Marina, heavy cardstock, embossed lettering, a sunset photograph of the marina full of borrowed boats mailed to every household in Cedar Ridge Estates and to civic leaders, county officials, and media partners throughout the region. Ethan received one in his mailbox. He read it once, set it on the kitchen counter, and the next morning put it in the binder under the tab labeled Opening Day. The morning of the grand opening was a Saturday in early October, and the weather was perfect in the particular way that East Texas weather is sometimes perfect in autumn, the air clean and cool, the sky a deep shade of blue that makes everything look more significant than it is, including things that are about to go very wrong. By 9 in the morning, the marina was already full of people. Residents had dressed up. There were women in sundresses and men in collared shirts, children in life vests carrying fishing poles that were more decoration than function grandparents in lawn chairs near the pavilion. A general atmosphere of civic pride and collective ownership, the feeling of a community that has done something together and is now standing inside the result. A local country band had set up on the pavilion deck and was playing the kind of cheerful, uncomplicated music that fits perfectly with champagne at 10 in the morning on a lakefront dock. Caterers moved through the crowd with trays of champagne flutes and small servings of smoked brisket on fancy napkins, which is a very Texas combination and was landing well. 16 slips held boats brought in for the occasion, and the whole waterfront scene genuinely looked like the renderings in the brochure, which is not something that usually happens with real estate renderings. Usually there is some gap between the rendering and the reality, something slightly smaller, slightly less finished, slightly more complicated than the image promised. This was different. This looked exactly like what Linda Harper had told people it would look like, which made what was about to happen both more dramatic and more complete. A local television news crew had set up near the ribbon and was doing pre-ceremony interviews. Linda Harper stood in front of the camera in a blazer the color of deep water and spoke about what she called the dream that became a dock. She talked about the HOA's collective effort, the community's investment in itself, the years of planning and cooperative vision and patient work. She mentioned the contractors, the architects, the county cooperation that had made the permitting possible. She did not mention Ethan Dawson. She did not mention Harold Dawson or Robert Dawson or the deed of 1948. She spoke about the lake as if it were a resource that had been waiting all along for someone with the proper vision to develop it correctly, and the camera operator nodded along and the crowd applauded warmly in the October light. Ethan arrived at the public access point near the old cedar fence line at 9:45, wearing the same flannel shirt and carrying the same thermos. He stood near the bait shack, his grandfather's bait shack, with the hand-painted Dawson Lake sign still nailed above the door. Faded but perfectly readable to anyone who cared to look, and he watched the ceremony from a distance, with the composed stillness of a man who is not surprised by what is happening, only waiting for the right beat in a piece of music he already knows by heart. Linda approached the ribbon at 10 o'clock with the silver scissors, and the county commissioner standing beside her, and she began her closing remarks. For too long, she said, her voice carrying across the water on the PA system, this lake sat underutilized. Today, it finally belongs to the community. She raised the scissors. The gravel road sound arrived before the vehicles were visible, that particular crunch of multiple heavy tires moving with intention, not just passing through. 3 Callaway County Sheriff's Department SUVs came down the access road and pulled to a stop in the grass near the staging area. 4 deputies got out, and behind them came 2 officers from the State Environmental Enforcement Division in their green uniforms, and behind them came a county attorney carrying a red-tabbed document folder. The country band stopped mid-song. The crowd turned. Linda Harper held the scissors in the air and watched the deputies unroll yellow closure tape, and for several long seconds she appeared to believe with genuine conviction that there had been some kind of administrative mistake, a miscommunication, the kind of confusion that could be cleared up with a phone call to the right person. That confidence was visible in her face. It was the last time it would be. Aaron Brooks walked to the ribbon in full uniform, calm and unhurried, and he introduced himself and spoke clearly enough for the crowd to hear without raising his voice. He had a closure order issued by the Callaway County District Court on the basis of unlawful commercial construction on private property not owned by the applicant. He had an environmental enforcement notice from the State Water Authority citing unapproved modification of a protected shoreline easement under the 1973 Flood Control Agreement. And he had a notice of criminal investigation related to the submission of materially false property boundary documentation in a county permit application. The television camera was still running. The camera operator had turned it toward Aaron and was holding it very steadily in the way that operators hold their cameras when they understand they are filming something that will be on the evening news and possibly several subsequent news cycles. The champagne trays had stopped moving. 200 people stood in complete silence, the kind of silence that only happens outdoors when every single person present has decided not to make a sound. Linda's corporate smile had finally dissolved, replaced by the dawning recognition that comes when you have been building something for a long time and you realize in one specific and entirely public moment that you built it on entirely the wrong ground. Aaron turned and looked across the crowd toward the old bait shack. Mr. Dawson. Ethan lifted his thermos slightly, not quite a wave, just an acknowledgement, the kind that takes one small motion and means a great deal. Would you like us to seal the entire marina right now? Ethan considered it for exactly as long as it took to draw a slow breath. "That'd be fine," he said. "Do what you need to do." And Aaron turned back to Linda Harper, who was still holding the silver scissors, and said quietly but clearly, "Ma'am, I need you to step back from the ribbon." The Marina did not open that day. It did not open the following week or the month after or at any point in the foreseeable future because by the time the dust settled from the opening day shutdown, the situation had grown considerably more complicated than a simple permit dispute. The county launched a full investigation into its own permitting process, which raised uncomfortable questions about how a commercial marina of that scale had been approved without a deed survey confirming the applicant's ownership of the affected property. The State Water Authority initiated its own review under the 1973 Flood Control Agreement and placed an immediate development freeze on the entire eastern shoreline, not just the disputed section, but the full protected zone, which turned out to be substantially larger than the HOA's attorneys had apparently bothered to map. The fuel dock was ordered removed within 60 days at the HOA's expense. The floating cafe platform was flagged pending environmental impact assessment, which meant the $1,200 membership fees Linda had been collecting now represented access to a facility that could not legally operate. The lawsuits arrived in layers. Residents who had paid for slip reservations filed against the HOA for misrepresentation. Investors who had been quietly brought into the project filed civil claims related to a fundamentally flawed title review. The HOA's insurance carrier sent a reservation of rights letter within 3 weeks of the shutdown, which is the insurance industry's way of saying, "We may not cover this, and you should start thinking very carefully about what comes next." The HOA board held an emergency meeting that lasted 4 hours and ended with 2 board members resigning. Linda Harper did not appear at that meeting or the one after it. Her Range Rover was absent from Cedar Ridge Estates for the better part of 2 weeks before reappearing. And when it did, it moved quietly without the ease and ownership it once carried through those streets. The HOA newsletter went silent. The glossy brochures disappeared from the community center rack. Fancy dreams do collapse fast once the yellow tape appears, and the tape, once properly placed by proper authorities, is remarkably difficult to argue with. The dismantling happened gradually, the way most things unravel piece by piece in the order that the county and the state required, without ceremony, without a news crew or a ribbon or a speech about community vision. The fuel dock came down first because the environmental order on that structure was the most urgent and the most specific. Workers spent 3 careful days removing the piping and tank infrastructure from the protected shoreline, working in the same area where the river reeds had been torn out months earlier, now marked off with a different kind of tape than the yellow that had gone up on opening day. The floating cafe platform came next once the environmental review determined that its anchoring system had disturbed a section of the protected lakebed below the waterline. The boat slips were a longer and more expensive process. The structural piers had been driven deep into the lake bottom, and the removal cost exceeded the original installation by a factor the HOA's attorney described in a court filing as substantial, which in legal filings is the word you use when the actual number is something you would prefer not to say out loud. The pavilion came down in stages through the winter, and by February, the eastern bank looked something close to what it had looked like before the excavators arrived, though the ground needed a full season or 2 to fully heal. The river reeds began to come back in March, thin and cautious at first, then more confidently as the spring came on and the soil remembered what it had been. The painted turtles returned to the nesting area in April, right on their quiet and unannounced schedule, as if they had simply been waiting somewhere nearby for the noise to stop. Ethan had his grandfather's original fence posts reset new concrete, new markers with the Dawson initials stamped fresh in the same positions the originals had stood for 76 years. He hired a local stonemason to create a small, permanent marker at the eastern cove cut from native limestone, with his father's name and the years he lived. He didn't hold a ceremony. He went down there alone on a Sunday morning, set the stone in place, and sat on the flat limestone shelf nearby for a while, watching the herons work the shallow water in the early light. The fog was low. The bass were moving near the surface in the particular way they move in May when nothing is frightening them. It was the kind of morning his father had loved, and the kind of morning Emma had loved, and the kind of morning the lake had been providing to the people who paid attention to it for longer than anyone currently alive could remember. Walter Greer, who was 81 years old and had been coming to fish Ethan's lake with permission for the better part of 2 decades, showed up on the first Saturday in May with his tackle box and his ancient fiberglass rod and his own dented thermos. He backed his truck to the old dock without ceremony, set up his aluminum lawn chair, and dropped his line in the water and sat in the morning light as if nothing had happened and everything was fine. Which, in the way that matters most, it was. The bays were in the same places they always were. The light came across the water at the same angle it had been coming across every May morning since Harold Dawson first drove out to this county with a cashier's check in his breast pocket. And it was beautiful in the simple, persistent way that things are beautiful when they belong to themselves and are not being asked to be anything else. There are lessons that take a long time to learn and a very long time to forget. Confidence is not a deed. A presentation is not a property survey. The ability to organize other people's enthusiasm is not the same as the legal right to build on the ground beneath their feet. A zoning map is not a title. A glossy brochure is not a county record. And the things that are written down carefully in limestone courthouses in the spring of 1948 tend to outlast a great many things built in a hurry on top of assumptions that nobody bothered to verify. Linda Harper had moved through the world for 15 years in corporate real estate with the unexamined assumption that size and momentum and the right kind of professional confidence could substitute for the actual documented facts of who owns what. That assumption works in certain environments for a surprisingly long time. It stops working the moment someone with a binder full of certified copies and the patience to wait for the right moment decides that enough is enough. The lake was never angry about any of it. That is perhaps the strangest thing about the whole story and the truest. The lake didn't care about Linda Harper's vision or Harold Dawson's deed or the yellow tape or the county investigation or the lawsuits or the board resignations. It provided what it had always provided: cool water and morning fog and bass jumping at the surface before the heat came on, herons standing in the shallows at dusk, the particular silence of a place that has not been made to perform. It was there when Harold Dawson came back from the Pacific and needed something entirely his own. It was there when Robert Dawson taught a small boy patience with a cane pole and an overturned bucket. It was there when Emma Caldwell told her husband that the lake was the most honest place she had ever been. It was there when the excavators tore up the eastern bank, and it was there when the reed grass came back in spring without being asked, and it was there on the first Saturday in May when Walter Greer dropped his line in the water and sat in the morning light and waited without hurry and without apology. The water did what water does. It found its own level. The truth in the end is like that it doesn't announce itself or fight for attention or send out embossed invitations on heavy cardstock. It simply floats back to the surface eventually because that is the nature of things that are real. The lake was never angry. It just had some visitors for a little while who confused enthusiasm with ownership volume, with authority, and a zoning map with a deed. When the documents came out of the courthouse and the yellow tape went up on opening day and the cameras caught every moment of it in real time, what was revealed wasn't a scandal, so much as a correction, the kind the land makes. Slowly and without drama when the paperwork finally catches up to the ambition. Ethan Dawson finished his coffee, set the thermos down on the dock, picked up a cane pole, and waited.